The rain was relentless, turning the city streets into shimmering rivers of neon-lit puddles. It was the kind of night where most people sought shelter, but Jack Mercer sat unmoving under the crumbling awning of a closed pawn shop. A tattered hood shielded his face, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. To anyone passing by, he was just another homeless man, forgotten by the world. But Jack Mercer was far from ordinary. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, tracked every movement around him. The woman hurrying past, gripping her purse too tightly. The teenager hesitating by the liquor store, contemplating a bad decision. The sedan idling 2 blocks down, engine still running, driver scanning the street like he was looking for someone. Mercer noticed it all, processed it instinctively. It was muscle memory, training so deeply ingrained it never truly faded. Then the cruiser pulled up. Officer Travis Boone stepped out first, adjusting his duty belt. He was built like a linebacker, his gut straining against the Kevlar vest. His reputation preceded him. Boone and his squad didn't patrol the streets to protect people, they hunted them. Boone's smirk widened as he spotted Mercer. "Well, well, what do we have here?" His voice dripped with mockery. "City ordinance says loitering's a no-go, old-timer." Jack didn't respond. His fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Boone's type thrived on power, on fear. Silence only made them push harder. A second officer, Donahue, chuckled as he nudged Mercer's duffel bag with his boot. It slumped over, spilling out what little Mercer had left. A change of clothes, a water bottle, a small metal box. The latter clattered against the pavement. Boone's eyes flicked toward it. "What's this?" Boone crouched, snatching it up before Jack could react. He popped the lid open. Dog tags. A faded photograph. His smirk curled into something uglier. "Oh, so you're one of those guys, military, and now you're just another bum who couldn't hack it in the real world?" Jack's jaw tensed. For the first time, his gaze lifted, locking onto Boone's. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Mercer's dark eyes. Cold. Calculating. Boone's grin faltered for a fraction of a second. He masked it with bravado. "That's the problem with you guys. Think you're better than the rest of us." His boot came down hard on the box, smashing it into the wet concrete. "You ain't." Jack inhaled deeply, slow, controlled, counting. 1, 2, 3. Boone's hand dropped to his baton. The tension in the air thickened. Donahue shifted slightly, uncomfortable. 4, 5, 6. "Move along," Boone ordered, voice hard, "or we'll move you." Mercer remained still. He wasn't defying Boone. He was studying him, measuring him. 7, 8, 9. A slow smile, almost imperceptible, tugged at the corner of Mercer's lips. It wasn't amusement. It was something Boone didn't recognize, something that should have made him walk away. But Boone was too stupid to realize the mistake he had just made. Jack Mercer sat in the dimly lit holding cell, his back straight, hands resting on his knees. Blood from the cut above his eyebrow dripped down his cheek, mixing with the sweat and grime from the rain-soaked streets. Across from him, Officer Travis Boone leaned against the bars, baton tapping lightly against his palm. "You don't talk much, do you?" Boone sneered. "That's all right. We've got ways of making people talk." Jack didn't move. He didn't react. Boone hated that. "See, guys like you think you're untouchable. You think just 'cause you played soldier overseas, you still matter." Boone stepped closer, lowering his voice. "But out here, you're nothing. Just another washed-up vet who couldn't handle real life." Jack's eyes flicked up, meeting Boone's with quiet intensity. Not angry, not afraid, just watching, calculating. The door to the precinct buzzed open. The desk sergeant called out, "Got a hit on the prince. You're going to want to see this." Boone hesitated, then turned and followed the officer to a nearby terminal. Jack listened. A moment later, Boone's voice dropped, no longer filled with arrogance. What do you mean, classified? The officer at the computer swallowed hard. Department of Defense flagged his file, says level 5 clearance required. That's above the captain's pay grade. We're supposed to call DOD immediately. Boone stared at the screen, hands tightening into fists. Then his personal phone buzzed. An unknown number. He stepped away from the desk and answered. A cold, professional voice greeted him. This is Colonel James Briggs. You have a man in custody. Jack Mercer. Release him immediately. Boone scoffed, forcing confidence into his tone. Sir, with all due respect, he assaulted an officer. That means... This is not a request. The voice cut through like a blade. Clear his record of tonight's incident. Hand him his belongings. And Boone? The officer swallowed hard. Pray you haven't done anything regrettable. The line went dead. Boone turned, staring at Jack through the cell bars. Mercer hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. He just sat there, watching. Something in Boone's gut twisted. Minutes later, Jack was handed his belongings, minus the metal box Boone had stomped on earlier. Boone shoved the plastic evidence bag at him. Looks like you've got friends in high places, he muttered. Jack took the bag without a word. As he reached the precinct's exit, he paused beside Officer Jake Reynolds, the young cop who had been watching the whole thing from the sidelines. Jack's voice was calm, almost conversational. Choose carefully who you follow. Then he stepped out into the rain, disappearing into the city streets. Boone stood frozen, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had thought he'd been dealing with just another bum. Now, for the first time, he felt it. Fear. The city pulsed with life, but Jack Mercer moved through it like a ghost. Days had passed since his release, and Boone hadn't come looking for him, but Jack knew better. The hunt had already begun. Jack had spent his nights watching, listening. He tracked Boone's movements, the way he met with the same people in the same dark alleys, exchanging cash for silence. It wasn't just corruption, it was organized crime. Boone wasn't just a dirty cop. He was a piece of something much bigger. The deeper Jack dug, the more familiar the pattern became. Drugs, human trafficking, weapons moving through the city like clockwork. And at the top of it all was Victor Langley. Jack recognized the name immediately. Langley was untouchable, a billionaire whose charities and political ties masked an empire built on suffering. Jack had encountered men like him before, the ones who never got their hands dirty, letting others do the bleeding for them. The problem was, Langley had just found out Jack was back. Inside a high-rise office, Victor Langley set his whiskey glass down and took a slow breath. His private security chief, Marcus Weiss, stood across from him, stone-faced. "Tell me again," Langley said, voice calm but dangerous. Weiss exhaled. "Jack Mercer. Confirmed sighting. The police had him, but DOD forced his release." Langley clenched his jaw. "And Boone? Did he do what I pay him for?" "It's tried," Weiss admitted. "But Mercer's different. He's not just some old operator living on the streets. He's been watching." Langley tapped a finger against the desk. "Then let's make it clear, he's the one being watched now." Weiss nodded. "Already taken care of." Jack felt the tail before he saw them. He'd been trained to recognize surveillance, the subtle shifts in traffic, the same man at the coffee shop 2 days in a row, the car that never seemed to turn. Langley had sent professionals, but Jack was better. He led them into an abandoned parking structure, disappearing into the shadows. When the first man entered, Jack was already behind him. A swift chokehold cut off his air before he could make a sound. One down. The second was more cautious. He swept the space with a silenced pistol, but Jack wasn't there anymore. He moved like a predator, silent, efficient. The man barely had time to react before Jack's elbow snapped into his throat. 2 down. The last man turned to run. Jack led him, because he needed Langley to know he was coming. Jack Mercer moved with purpose. Langley had made his move, now it was Jack's turn. He spent the next 3 nights dismantling Langley's empire piece by piece. A warehouse filled with illegal arms shipments burned to the ground. A mid-level enforcer running Langley's drug operations found in an alley, unconscious, with just enough evidence left behind for the feds to pick up. Each hit was precise, surgical. Jack wasn't just fighting back, he was sending a message. Victor Langley was livid. He paced inside his luxury penthouse, gripping a glass of bourbon so tightly his knuckles turned white. Across from him, Marcus Weiss stood with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. 3 operations hit in 72 hours, Langley growled. That's not a coincidence. Weiss nodded. It's Mercer. Langley slammed the glass onto the desk. Then why is he still breathing? Weiss's jaw tightened. He's not making mistakes. No patterns, no loose ends. Every move he makes is controlled. Langley inhaled sharply, trying to calm the fury boiling inside him. Then his phone buzzed. A text. Check your doorstep. Langley frowned, motioning to one of his bodyguards. The man disappeared for a moment, then returned carrying a small package. Langley unwrapped it carefully, his breath hitching as he saw the contents. A single bullet, engraved with a number. His own address. Langley's blood ran cold. Weiss leaned over, glancing at the bullet. Then he smiled slightly. He's hunting you. Langley exhaled, forcing himself to regain control. Fine. If Mercer wanted a war, he'd get one. Boone was already drunk when Langley's call came in. He fumbled for his phone, cursing under his breath. You were supposed to keep him quiet, Langley hissed, the moment Boone answered. Boone wiped his sweaty face. What do you want me to do? The guy's a ghost. Langley's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Then we make him bleed. His way. Boone frowned. What the hell does that mean? Langley didn't answer. The line went dead. Across the city, Jack sat in the shadows of a rooftop, watching Boone through a rifle scope. The cop looked terrified. Jack smirked. Good. The war had just begun. Jack Mercer knew the counterattack was coming. He just didn't know when. Langley wasn't the type to run scared. Jack had pushed him, exposed him, and now Langley would push back. The question wasn't if, but how. Jack had been hunting predators long enough to know that when they felt cornered, they got desperate. Desperate men made mistakes. Inside a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, Officer Travis Boone nursed his 3rd drink of the night. His nerves shot to hell. The fear was eating him alive, and he knew exactly why. Mercer was out there, watching, waiting, and now Boone wasn't even sure whose side he was on. His phone buzzed. Langley. He considered ignoring it, but he knew better. With a heavy sigh, he answered. You're getting sloppy. Langley's voice came through cold and sharp. Mercer is still breathing. Boone swallowed hard. I'm telling you, the guy is a ghost. You want him dead, you handle it. Langley's silence was heavy. Then, oh, I will. But I need something first. Boone rubbed his forehead. What? Langley's voice turned sinister. Bait. Boone sat up straight, suddenly sober. What the hell does that mean? It means Mercer doesn't react to threats against himself, Langley explained. But he's got a soft spot for lost causes, like that rookie cop, Reynolds. Boone's blood ran cold. He's clean, he's not part of this. It is now. Langley's voice was final. Bring me Reynolds, or I bring Mercer to you. The line went dead. Boone sat there, breathing hard, knowing he had just been given a death sentence, one way or another. Jack was already outside the bar when Boone staggered out an hour later. He'd heard everything. Boone stumbled toward his car, keys jingling in his unsteady hands. Jack was on him before he could react, a swift hand over the mouth, a blade pressed to his ribs. If you scream, you die, Jack whispered. Boone froze. Jack dragged him into a nearby alley, slamming him against the wall. "You set up Reynolds?" Boone gasped, shaking his head. "No, Langley wants him, not me." Jack's grip tightened. "Where?" Boone hesitated a second too long. Jack twisted the knife just enough for him to feel it. "Where?" Boone cracked. "Warehouse on 12th, midnight." Jack let him go. Boone collapsed, gasping for air. Jack's expression was unreadable as he stepped back into the shadows. If Langley wanted a trap, Jack would give him one. But on his terms. The warehouse on 12th Street was Langley's stage, but Jack Mercer was about to rewrite the script. Midnight was approaching, and Jack moved like a shadow through the alleyways, taking in every detail. The warehouse had two visible entrances, one at the front, heavily guarded, and another at the back, likely just as fortified. A third, smaller side entrance was partially concealed by stacked shipping containers. That would be his way in. Jack knew how Langley operated. This wasn't just an execution, it was a show. Langley wanted Jack to see Reynolds suffer, to break him before making the kill. That meant Langley would have an audience. Armed guards, hired killers. Jack was walking into a war zone. Fine. He'd fought in worse. Inside the warehouse, Jake Reynolds was cuffed to a steel chair in the center of the room, his face bloodied but his spirit intact. Langley stood nearby, watching with cold amusement as Marcus Weiss circled Reynolds like a shark. Weiss had been the one delivering the punishment. Calculated, controlled. Never enough to knock Reynolds out, just enough to hurt. "I don't get it," Reynolds muttered, spitting blood onto the concrete floor. "You go through all this trouble, just for me?" Langley chuckled, sipping his drink. "You misunderstand. This isn't about you, Officer Reynolds. You're just bait." Reynolds' eyes darkened. "For Mercer." Langley's smirk widened. "Exactly." Weiss checked his watch. "He'll come." Langley nodded. "Of course he will." A gunshot rang out. Not from inside the warehouse. From the perimeter. Then another. Weiss turned sharply toward the entrance. "What the hell?" A guard near the back door screamed, followed by the sharp crack of a suppressed rifle. Langley's smirk vanished. Jack Mercer was already here. Jack moved through the darkness, taking down guards one by one. He hadn't brought an army. He didn't need one. The first man dropped with a knife to the throat, his body slumping silently against a stack of crates. The second turned just in time to see Jack's silenced pistol before a single round ended him. The numbers were against him. That didn't matter. Jack was relentless, methodical, every move calculated. The final breach was coming. Inside, Langley and Weiss were losing control, and Reynolds saw his opening. Langley had loosened his grip on the gun in his hand, just for a second, but long enough. Reynolds surged forward, slamming the chair into Langley's knee, making the crime lord stumble. Weiss spun, gun raised. Jack's voice cut through the chaos. "Weiss." Weiss froze. Jack stood at the entrance, gun leveled at Weiss's head. Reynolds exhaled. The real fight was about to begin. The warehouse was dead silent. Jack Mercer stood at the entrance, his gun trained on Marcus Weiss. Langley groaned from the floor, clutching his knee where Reynolds had struck him. His arrogance was gone, replaced by raw fear. Weiss, however, remained steady, his cold eyes locked onto Jack's. "I was wondering when you'd show up," Weiss said, voice calm. Jack tilted his head slightly. "And yet, you still got sloppy." Weiss smirked. "We'll see about that." Before Jack could react, Weiss lunged, drawing his own pistol. A split-second decision. Jack fired first. The bullet caught Weiss in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He crashed into a crate, but even wounded, he was reaching for another weapon. Jack didn't hesitate. He was already moving. By the time Weiss had his second gun up, Jack was on him, slamming his forearm into Weiss's throat and driving him backward. The fight turned brutal. No finesse, no hesitation, just pure survival. Weiss fought like a trained killer, but Jack had spent his life surviving worse. A sharp elbow to Weiss's temple, a knee to his ribs. Jack grabbed Weiss's wrist, twisted and snapped the bone clean. Weiss crumpled, gasping in pain. Jack stood over him, gun raised. "You don't walk away from this." That. Weiss laughed through the pain. "Maybe not, but neither do you." A clicking sound. The grenade pin. Weiss grinned as he dropped the live grenade from his hand. Jack's instincts took over. In a blink, he grabbed Reynolds and threw them both behind cover as the explosion tore through the warehouse. The shockwave sent crates and debris flying. Fire and smoke filled the air. Coughing, Jack pulled Reynolds to his feet. Through the flames, Langley was crawling toward the exit. Jack's eyes darkened. He caught up in 2 strides, stumping on Langley's injured knee. The crime lord screamed. "No more running," Jack said, his voice deadly calm. Langley looked up at him, shaking. "It's just business, Mercer." Jack pressed the barrel against Langley's forehead. "So is this." A moment passed, then another, and Jack lowered the gun. "I'm not killing you," he said, "but the FBI will be interested in what's left of your empire." Langley's face twisted in horror as sirens blared in the distance. Jack turned to Reynolds. "We're done here." Together they disappeared into the night. Jack Mercer's story isn't just about revenge. It's about justice, survival, and the cost of doing what's right. He didn't set out to be a hero, but when corruption threatened innocent lives, he chose to act. This story highlights the dangers of unchecked power, the thin line between law and criminality, and how one determined person can bring down an empire built on fear. It's a reminder that in a world where justice is often compromised, sometimes it takes a ghost from the past to set things right. But what do you think? Was Jack right to spare Langley, or should he have ended it? Can justice truly exist when the system is corrupt? Would you have made the same choices? Let's talk in the comments. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next gripping story. More tales of justice, action, and redemption are coming soon.